evening, everybody. Although this is going to be sent out on Thursday evening, I'm actually recording it on Tuesday evening after a bitterly cold day. I believe it's only been about 6 degrees here in Johannesburg, certainly in the Parkhurst area, and I've just heard recently that snow is falling in Ramsey. And oh my goodness, I'm sure all sorts of snow stories are coming to the fore now. I can just imagine, and in my imagination this makes me feel very, very happy, all of us sitting around a fire, toasting marshmallows and telling stories. Stories are so much part of what makes us human beings. And there's a story behind the Eucharist this past Sunday. Some of you, if you watched it, will remember that Mexico appeared in it. That's our cat. So the background to that story is that the first time I recorded the Eucharist, I decided that I needed to do a bit of editing at the beginning and at the end to save Brogan some time so that I could really send him the completed product. Unfortunately, what happened was that I edited the entire Eucharist, and all that was left of that whole recording was the blessing. Now, by this stage, I was beginning to be a little bit under pressure in terms of time, so I went ahead and, after a prayer, decided to do the second recording, and that's when Mexico decided to come and visit. Not at all part of my plans. What most of you don't know is that as he was sitting on my lap, unless of course you enlarge the picture, you would have seen this, he kept on having little munches on my arm, almost having a Eucharist of my arm. And inside of me, I had these little bubbles, like champagne bubbles, of laughter and giggles that wanted to come up. But I was very aware that I was in the prayer of consecration, and for me that's a very reverential and awe-filled time, and so I didn't do that. Of course, by the time I'd come to the end of the recording, I started wondering, should I record again for the third time? But as I said earlier, I was very conscious of the time that was needed for Brogan and editing and getting it to him. And I decided that somewhere along the line, perhaps God was trying to teach me something through that. But more about that later. You received, of course, the product, or should I say less of the product and more of the prayer video of Eucharist that you saw on Sunday. So, stories are so important. And especially when we are living through history, the stories that we experience and create in the midst of those are part of what's going to form us as humanity. If we could only but be like St. Teresa of Calcutta and allow ourselves to be pencils in God's hand, then there would be, over and above the heartache and the pain and the sadness of the stories, also stories that are delightful and indeed have universal truths within that. I look forward to hearing some of your stories when we can catch up one of these days, so please store them. They mean a lot to me, and hopefully they mean a lot to you as well. Stories can take many forms. They can be in the forms of poetry and prose. They can be short stories, long stories, epics. But all of them matter because they reveal something of you, something of me, something of our shared human experience. Megan McKenna has written an amazing book called We Live Inside a Story. And there are 2 quotes from that book that I would like to refer to now. The first one reads as follows: "Stories remind us how to climb inside each other's souls." Let me repeat that. Stories remind us how to climb inside each other's souls. And the second one, all stories are true, and some of them actually happened. All stories are true, and some of them actually happened. And we know that Jesus used stories all the time. We refer to them commonly as parables. And they are vehicles to touch our hearts, our spirits, our very lives, to create connection, to draw aside a veil into heaven's meaning, to inform and to communicate existential meaning, to teach, to reveal, and so much more. Those are just the beginnings of unpacking some of the layers. Stories, when we allow them to be held within the great God story, which is our enfolding love story, then we know that we create a kind of glue, because stories have soul to them, and that glue reads our stories, our lives. As listeners, we begin to have a greater understanding of who we are because of the glue that stories bring into our realization of all that is meaningful. And stories also read the tragedy, the goodness, the truth that is within all. We just need to choose to listen and to let the truth inhabit our flesh, our blood, our very beings. I remember as a child, one of the things that often filled our home was the smell of rusks baking. My mom used to make rusks. She always had a yeast plant, and it was kept on the windowsill in the kitchen. So for those of us who perhaps don't know much about rusk making, not that I made the rusks, but of course I watched some of the process and helped occasionally knead the rusks. We know that there are ingredients. Of course, the key ingredient, other than the others, is the yeast from the yeast plant, which is the rising agent. The dough needs to be kneaded quite extensively, and that folding and aerating, I remember doing that sometimes as well with my little hands. Then it was wrapped in a cloth and put in a basin, and it had to lie dormant, and the fertilization would happen in the rising as it would lie for probably overnight. But often my mom, if the weather was cold, would put hot water bottles on top of that as well. And then as the rusks were cut and baked in the oven, that scent was wonderful, filling the whole home with it. We would often then afterwards, once it was baked, before my mom dried them out in the warming drawer, we would often cut or break off pieces of that soft baked rusk and butter them and eat them. What nourishment, what delight, and what a wonderful sharing in that experience of relishing the tastiness of that. And in many ways, that's part of what stories are like, aren't they? They also need to ferment. They also sometimes need to lie dormant in our lives until we're ready to see what is bubbled up from within the depths of our being to the light of our understanding. There are some stories that we can't share with everybody, and those are ones where we've got to tell them to the appropriate people. But share them we must, in order to explore the wisdom, the insight, perhaps even the gravitas of what it is about. Sometimes we just need to let stories find us, like my experience with our cat, Mexico. As I've pondered on that story, as I've chewed on it, I realize that sometimes what I try to do in my life is control an outcome, even when I was recording that Eucharist, I had a sense of how I wanted it to be as my gift to all of you. And then I realized, as Mexico kept trying to pull my arm down because he wanted me to hold him, he had his own plan for how he wanted things to be as he was sitting on my lap. And I had my plan of how I wanted that recording to go. And maybe, just maybe, it would have been part of God's plan if I had just allowed the giggles to come to the surface and just to laugh. Maybe that would have been God's Eucharist for Sunday. And by insisting on things going my way, I actually put a restraint on God's love story. And maybe that's my learning that has come through that story. Because really, isn't there just one story, ultimately? At least there is for me, the more I think and reflect about it, and that's God's story. God is my story. At least I want God to be my story, and all my other stories are within that story, and hopefully will reveal more and more of God's story, or distract or subtract from it. But as I surrender more into that divine love story, I hope my stories will be able to tell me more of how to be in God's story. If we hear a story often enough, and sometimes even our self-talk is a form of story, but if we hear a story often enough, we begin to believe it. And in a way, we become the stories we tell ourselves. So what is the story you are going to tell about this lockdown? The stories we're going to create within it, because we do have that power. What are the stories that are beginning to form us just through the words we use about this experience? What are the stories Holy Spirit is whispering to our souls? Are we adding to them? Are we allowing them to be like yeast, to grow, to form us, to nourish, to be the deepest nutrients, so that the history that will be written about this time will not only be about the facts that scientists, that clinicians, that historians put in place, but will also carry some of God's story, will be the ongoing revelation of what it is to be part of God's story. So once upon a time, this happened. What is going to be your story? I look forward to hearing it one day, or maybe even in one of the many telephone conversations we can share together. And then we truly can end, because we know we are part of the God story, and they lived happily ever after. Good night.